There is breaking news. A judge has just ordered former President Donald Trump's bond in his New York fraud trial reduced to $175 million. That is down from the more than $460 million that was due today. He now has 10 days to post the reduced bond. Bloomberg's Eric Larson.
And as Trump's lawyers argued, for a privately held company, the Trump organization is huge, but not, as massive as some big corporations, that it was just really difficult for them to arrange a bond of this size. So it's all kind of novel. It's an unusual situation all around.
Bloomberg's Eric Larson speaking just a few moments ago. Meanwhile, Donald Trump called his hush money case a witch hunt and a hoax. The former president is in a New York court for a hearing in the case. It has been recessed until noon. UN Security Council calls for a ceasefire in Gaza during the Muslim Holy Month in the Israeli-Hamas conflict. It is their first demand to halt the fighting. The Supreme Court will hear its biggest case on abortion since overturning Roe v. Wade 2 years ago. The High Court has to decide whether to ratify a ruling from a conservative federal appeals court that would limit access to the widely used abortion medication mifepristone. The judges will also weigh in on whether former President Trump can face criminal prosecution. The court will make those rulings without long-serving liberal Justice Stephen Breyer, who retired 2 years ago. Breyer has released a new book, Reading the Constitution.
You overrule too many cases and the law will turn into chaos. And before you know it, you won't know what the law is. But what is the principle? Is the principle that you think those cases decided then were really wrong, egregiously wrong, totally wrong? And how are you going to decide that?
Breyer was succeeded by one of his former law clerks, Ketanji Brown Jackson. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg.
about culture is they call organizations superorganisms. It's a collection of people, but the collection is greater than the individuals combined. So 1 + 1 is not 2. Ideally, it's 3 and greater. So if you were to look at a single person, a person has a set of core values. They may have dreams and aspirations. If you kind of map that to an organization, you can also think of the culture as your core values, personal core values turn into corporate core values, your organization's strengths and weaknesses. All those things collectively combined is something that we kind of put a label on it called the culture. A culture is like a muscle memory. It's very hard to change a habit. It's very hard to just say, hey, today we're going to define our culture as XYZ. We're just going to change this way. Like, it doesn't work like that. It's a collection of people's habits. That's like, again, like a superorganism. So you have to like really nudge and create an iterative feedback loop. It's a slowly evolving thing. So that's why it's so critical. Like your day-to-day decision-making, day-to-day operation, everyday execution is really dictated by the culture of your organization, not by a couple of like checklists. It's not what you write on the wall. It's what you do and live and breathe every day. And that is the culture.
Economic data this week. Today, we've already learned February new home sales. They were lower than expected at 662,000. Tomorrow, we have a report on consumers' confidence, and then it continues on Good Friday when the markets are closed. We have income on spending data as well as PCE inflation figures, and also this week, revised GDP data. So jam-packed. Right now, we'll head to the NASDAQ, which is little change. The Dow down about 0.2%. The S&P 500 down about 0.1%. The 2-year yield is higher at 4.64%. That's up about 4 basis points. The 10-year yield at 4.25%, and that's up about 5 basis points. On the commodities front, we have spot gold higher at $2,175 an ounce. And over to oil, NYMEX crude, $82 a barrel. Brent crude at $87 a barrel. And we have the dollar weaker. Japanese yen, euro, British pound, that's stronger. Bitcoin up about 5% at 69,693. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Alex.
All right, Lisa Mateo, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio, streaming live on YouTube as well. Well, 35 years on Wall Street, I've had the pleasure of working some really, really good groups of people, and none better, Mount Rushmore type, were the people at Payne Weber, 1986 to 1989. The Management Audit and Control Group, don't ask, it's top secret. Mike Sullivan ran that group, and pretty much everybody in that group went on to have a pretty darn good career, and none more than my man, Joe DeGrossa. He's the chairman. He's the CEO of Axis Capital. I'm scared to ask what Axis Capital is, but he is in Miami, Florida, and he did that decades before it became trendy here. He's been down there kind of running money down there for a long time. Joe, thanks so much for joining us. You're one of the all-time greats. Tell us what you're up to at Axis Capital these days.
Yeah, well, first of all, that throwback to the mid-'80s just dated me. So,
Exactly.
But it's nice hearing your voice. It's been way too long. So a few things. I've been down here in Miami 26 years now. I moved from Payne Weber and joined a private equity firm that turned out to be pretty successful, and launched my own firm some years ago, and so run a family office as well as a private equity shop down here in Miami.
So what are you guys doing in the markets here today? I'm guessing you're not running a 60-40 portfolio, Joe.
Clearly not running a 60-40 portfolio. Our main focus today, as you can probably see by the background, at least for viewers who are watching the live stream, we're focused on, with Axis Capital, introducing interval funds, really focused on this massive underserved market of accredited investors, folks with sort of 1 to 5 million that represent the mass affluent that up to now really have not been able to invest in private investments. So we think the next big wave in the capital markets will be a significant reallocation among, I'll call it the mass affluent, into private investing, because they're living longer. They need to match assets and liabilities, make sure they don't outlive their income. And so we're building a suite of products that we believe will serve that accredited investor market very well.
Okay, we're burying all the leads here, people. What was Paul like in the 80s?
Paul was fantastic. I mean, I have nothing but fond memories, Paul. It's been too long, and I know we're due to have a reunion pretty soon, but Paul was a great guy to work with. He really was.
It's funny, we had a great group. Again, I've got my Payne Weber group, I got my Chase Manhattan group, my Solomon Brothers group. The Payne Weber group, almost person for person, I'm talking a couple dozen people went on to have really good careers. We kind of thought Joe was going to be the black sheep, but he's ended up doing the best here. He's still at it here. Joe, you mentioned private credit here. That's been a market that I've been really amazed to watch develop really over the last 10 to 15 years. It used to be kind of private equity was the place you go for some outsized returns. How do you guys think about private credit?
Well, look, I think private credit has stepped in where the banks have walked away, and regulations on the banking side have made it, challenging for banks to maintain market share in that space. And so you've had a proliferation of funds, private credit funds getting into this space. And of course, Paul, as you know, interest rates have been on the side of credit for a long time, up until recently, up until 22, but they rode a 10, 15-year wave of a declining interest rate environment. So the total returns have looked particularly strong in that space. I think what we're going to see now, prospectively, is the major comeback of private equity. I think that's going to be the place to be over the next 5 to 10 years, notwithstanding a lot of talk about capital flowing into that space over the years.
Okay, first of all, you guys are both seriously disappointing me of what Paul was like 20, 40 years ago, but whatever, we'll let that slide. Wait, you said private equity? Because I feel like hasn't the whole thing been private credit, not private equity now?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, there's, 80 or 90 interval funds now in the credit space, maybe a dozen equity funds. So, people have been chasing returns and they've been looking in the rearview mirror. I think the future looking forward is allocations to private equity. And I'll tell you for a very simple reason. People are living longer. They, clearly, there's this massive generational transfer of wealth from a risk-averse generation to a risk-tolerant generation that I think is more informed. They know they're going to live on average 3 to 5 years longer, than their parents or certainly their grandparents, and they're going to have to allocate capital accordingly. And that means over the long term, as we know, equities over the long term, trounce fixed income, notwithstanding what's happened over the past 10 years.
So, Joe, you were, as you mentioned, you got down to South Florida way before it became trendy here. Talk to us about how Miami has changed just over the last 4 or 5 years. I mean, kind of pandemic. It seems like everybody and their brother's moving down there.
It's really been incredible. I mean, I've been down here, as I said, roughly 26 years, and we've seen more change in the past 5 years than we saw in the prior, call it 2021 years. And I think that's, certainly driven by COVID, and no question about it. But I think COVID, in concert with technology, has made people realize and has accelerated the understanding that you can be most anywhere in the world and work. And why not be in a beautiful place? I mean, when I moved down here, it was really driven by the fact that I had an opportunity to join a private equity shop, and it could have been in Tuscaloosa, it could have been in Idaho. Now what we're seeing is I'd call it the sort of that Malcolm Gladwell tipping point here in Miami, where you almost have to be here as a firm. If you're in the wealth management space, if you're in the private equity space, you have to be here because this is where the action is. And it's a great quality of life, and we all know taxes are far lower down here.
Oh,
so
man, you're killing Paul right now. You're literally killing him, Joe.
Exactly.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. All right. So talk to what is it? You mentioned interval capital, Joe. What is that concept?
Well, it's Access Capital is our firm, but we're really focused on launching a suite of interval funds, and it's really this simple. The Investment Company Act of 1940 basically says if you're super rich, a qualified purchaser with $5 million or more, you can invest in private equity and private credit funds. There's that line of demarcation, though. If you are not a wealthy investor, $5 million or more, you're basically shut out. And there's only one way to offer products to accredited investors, folks with between 1 and 5 million, and that's to register your vehicles. And that's the safe harbor under the Investment Company Act of 40 that says if you register your vehicles, just like sort of like an IPO, then you can bring in an unlimited number of, I'll call them smaller investors. And, what we're seeing is there's $15 trillion among accredited investors, about 1% invested in private investments. Compare that to qualified purchasers, folks with 5 million or more, who are at 10% allocated to private investments. Goldman Sachs' most recent family office report says that Family offices are 27% invested in private investments. So we believe the future is in the smaller investor.
Yep. Joe, great to talk to you again, buddy. Always good. And always knew you were doing well down there in South Florida, doing it way before anybody else was. Joe DeGrosso, he's the chairman and CEO of Axis Capital, based down in Miami, Florida. We both started our careers, Payne Weber, June 16th, 1986.
Amazing. Okay, so what was Joe like?
Funny. The really funny guy in our group. We actually just had a great group of people. We're still very tight. We get together every year or two, dinner at Smith & Wollensky's in Midtown Manhattan. People come in flying from all over the world to come in and kind of hook up. Because
so cool.
for a lot of us, it was the first job out of college, and it was a really tight group, and we stayed tight throughout the year. So it's a good group, good way to start your career.
I love this story.
Yeah. And see, that's the example I bring up. If you're working from home, you don't get that. And I don't. And I'll tell you what, that's what it's all about for me. So good stuff. Check it out. This is Bloomberg.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, I'm Lisa Mateo. Sweeping management changes over at Boeing. Its president CEO Dave Calhoun will step down at the end of 2024. Now, effective today, commercial airplanes president and CEO Stan Deal will retire, replaced by Chief Operating Officer Stephanie Pope. Bloomberg's George Ferguson has more on what led to that shakeup.
I think it was more a death of a thousand cuts, right? It was just all the little problems that were coming through the manufacturing process, especially at Spirit Aerosystems, of just airplanes that just weren't completed correctly. And so I don't think it was any big event, but just the constancy of the problems coming out that were we're the beginning of the end for this.
And Boeing shares are up about 1% right now. To the tech space, where there's a new report that China has adopted new guidelines to limit the use of U.S.-made microprocessors and servers in government computers. Now, according to the Financial Times, the new rules mean that chips made by companies will gradually be replaced with local alternatives. Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow has those details.
The problem the Chinese have got is they don't have Chinese domestic players at the cutting edge of semiconductor manufacturing. And so if this is about AI or it's about the sort of edge case of compute, they're still kind of beholden to those US companies for the time being.
So checking in with Intel shares, they're down about 1%. AMD shares, they're up about 1%. And keeping it here in China, electric car maker BYD cut prices on more than 100 EV models in some of the most aggressive discounting in China's price war. And Nissan reportedly planning to slash the cost of manufacturing its EVs by 30%. And finally, some merger news. Novo Nordisk agreed to buy Cardior Pharmaceuticals for up to $1.1 billion to expand its treatments for heart disease. That's your company news at this hour. I'm Lisa Mateo.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
Happy Monday, everybody. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio, where we cover all the top headlines with our top analysts all around the world. We are live from Interactive Broker Studio right here in Midtown Manhattan. We also keep you updated on all the world and national news. And for that, we go to Michael Barr. Michael?
Thank you very much, Alex. Paul, Lisa, developing news. A New York appeals court agreed to slash the amount of the bond Donald Trump must post to cover a $454 million civil fraud verdict while he appeals it. The court has reduced it now to $175 million after the real estate mogul claimed he'd have to sell properties at a loss to raise cash. Bloomberg's Eric Larson.
My question now is, are they going to stand by what they said, which was that there was no way in the world they could get a bigger bond than $100 million? Or are they going to say, okay, fine, and circle back and try to see what they can do? Because he said that if it was anything more than $100 million, he'd be forced to sell some assets in order to raise that extra cash, because those companies that arrange bonds won't take his real estate as collateral.
Bloomberg's Eric Larson speaking to Alex and Paul just a few moments ago. Meanwhile, Donald Trump called his hush money case a witch hunt and a hoax. The former president is in a New York court for a hearing in the case. It has been recessed until noon. The Supreme Court is set to hear oral arguments tomorrow in a case centered reducing access to a widely used abortion drug. Mifepristone is usually part of a 2-pill regimen for medication abortion. The question is whether mifepristone can continue to be prescribed and mailed to individuals in the same manner as other medications. Medical professionals call it among the safest medications ever approved by the FDA, while the Christian conservative group suing the agency says the drug has led to tens of thousands of emergency complications. Loyola Law School professor Jessica Levinson.
You don't want a group of judges substituting their own judgment for those of scientists and experts when it comes to approving any type of drug.
Professor Jessica Levinson. Shohei Ohtani plans to speak to the media later today for the first time since the illegal gambling and theft allegations involving the Los Angeles Dodgers star and his interpreter. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Alex, Paul, and now John.
All right, Michael Barr. Very good. We appreciate that. Great story in the Wall Street Journal today. It is a popular idea long embraced by an array of politicians. Give teachers a raise, yet it hasn't happened in decades. Nationally, average teacher pay has barely budged since 1990, despite states pumping more funding into public schools across the country. New education dollars have instead gone towards additional staff, rising healthcare costs, and pension obligations. Alex, I raised my family in a town in New Jersey, very high taxes, but we felt okay because a lot of that went to the schools, and we have one of the best schools and systems in the state, and that's all good, and everybody, we kind of feel like it was money well spent. But you know, every few years when the teachers would come back to us and say, hey, we haven't had a pay raise or well below inflation, we're like, what? Where's our money going?
It's bananas.
Yeah.
It's bananas. My best friend was a school teacher. She now works for the DOE on a different side of education. But, I mean, there's just so many layers of issues to this. I mean, it's the union, number one, right? So you can't actually get rid of teachers that aren't doing well and performing well because of the union. And then that also sort of inhibits what you can do. Like, why am I going to pay a bad teacher more? I want to pay the good teachers more. But I agree, like, why are you making so little?
Yeah. Now some lawmakers are championing new pay mandates to force the issue amid elevated teacher turnover rates and a decline of people training to become teachers. In South Dakota earlier this month, Governor Kristi Noem signed into law a minimum teacher salary of $45,000, which will rise with inflation. Last year, Arkansas set new starting teacher pay at $50,000 and a 5-figure increase in many districts. The legislation also guaranteed every teacher at least a $2,000 raise in 2026. $50,000 and $60,000 minimums will go into effect in Tennessee and Maryland, respectively.
Do we think that if Congress didn't get a raise since 1990, that would be okay?
That'd be fine.
I mean,
I'm
just putting that out there.
Yeah.
Whatever. All right, that wraps it up on this Monday. Happy Monday, everybody. You made it through the first day on this shortened trading week that wraps up Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. Coming up, Balance of Power with Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
The moment of truth just got easier for Donald Trump. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as an appeals court cuts the bond the former president needs to pay in his civil fraud trial in New York by more than 2/3. This as Trump returns to court in a separate matter, the hush money criminal case against him. Think Stormy Daniels. We're going to talk about these developments and what might come a bit later on today, a very important day in the legal future of the former president, coming up with attorney Robert McWhirter. The government did not shut down over the weekend. At least we've got that. There are, though, big questions about Mike Johnson's tenure as Speaker. We're going to talk about this and all of our top stories with our signature panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are along for the ride. And we start, as always, with a look at Wall Street. For that, John Tucker helps us out in New York. Hey, John.
Joe Matthew, after posting the best week of the year, stocks starting off this week modestly lower. 8 of the 11 major industry groups in the S&P 500, they are down right now. Communication services, the biggest drag. And that's where you're going to find shares of Meta Platforms and Google parent Alphabet, Apple, Google, Meta being probed by the European Union in a test of their new digital law. A super microcomputer up for a third consecutive day, up right now about 9%, the best performing stock in the S&P 500. In the meantime, Ben Laidler over at eToro says the market rally is starting to broaden out.
This has been very US-led, it's been very tech-led. I think what we've just started to see, and I think this accelerates as we go through the year, is the rally broadens out and smaller, more cyclical sectors and bits of the world start to perform a lot better.
And data today, new home sales edging lower last month, the first loss since November. A data-heavy week. Thursday, investors bracing for the core PCE. That is the big one. S&P 500 right now, 10 points lower. That's down 0.2%, 52.24 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, 120 points lower, down 0.3%. NASDAQ 100, 40 points lower. That's down 0.2%. And the Russell 2000 is up right now, up 0.6%. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Now back to Balance of Power. Joe Matthew, welcome to Monday.
Hey, John. Yeah, you know, it is Monday, the Monday edition of Balance of Power. Everybody's peeking out of one eye, clearing out the cobwebs, trying to start the week, fighting through traffic to get to work. Unless you're in Washington, no traffic today because lawmakers just left town on about 2-week recess. But I'll tell you what, Monday's looking up for Donald Trump. Think of the anxiety he might have felt going to bed last night, thinking about the bond. This thing was, what, $454 million? He said he only had $100 million. Not to mention the other one, the Stormy Daniels case, going to get a new trial date today at some point, we're told. But look at this headline. Trump bond cut by 68%. This just happened. So we're about to likely find out how much money Donald Trump actually has, because he said previously he could only cover a bond of up to $100 million. Otherwise, he'd need to sell properties. Now it's $175 million while he appeals this verdict. This just dropped a short time ago while he awaits a trial date in the Bragg case, and that's been a doozy if you listen to the judge in that courtroom this morning. Both of these are going to bring news today, one way or the other. The moment of truth, as we said on the terminal. He'll either post bond or not, and they've already got apparently liens set to hit 2 properties of Donald Trump's in Westchester County, and then whether we're going to get an actual trial date for Bragg. Both of these will tell us an enormous amount as we head into the throes of this general election campaign. And we start our conversation today with a new voice, Robert McWhirter. We wanted to talk with somebody who had experience specifically in dealing with bond issues like this, a constitutional law expert and practicing criminal defense and civil rights lawyer in Maricopa County. Robert, it's great to see you. What's your reaction to this dollar figure being cut by so much? Why would they do this the day of if it just made life a lot easier for Donald Trump, or was that the aim?
Well, I think that was Trump's aim and the Trump defense team's aim. I think it's kind of sad. I've been practicing for over 30 years, and I have never seen a criminal defendant receive more consideration, more bend over backwards from the criminal justice system at all parts than has Donald Trump. There's an amount of loss here. The bond is meant to cover the loss so that when he eventually loses on appeal, that his victim, which is the people of the state of New York, can be made whole. And the court has just given him another pass. I got to tell you, I'm really wondering whether he can even raise the $175 million.
Well, that's a great question right now. As I mentioned, Donald Trump says he has $100 million, so we're about to find out exactly how much money he's got, although I suspect it would be a lot easier for him to loan or to borrow 75 than it would have for the whole freight here. Total damages in this case, $464 million, including $10 million in penalties against his sons and Alan Weiselberg, and it's 120% of the verdict, right? So he owes even more than that. What would compel the court to do this?
Well, you know, it is an unprecedented case in terms of its size and its scope. I also think what's compelling the court, there may be some people on the court who are just pro-Trump, but I think more than that is he keeps making claims that he's treated unfairly, and the courts are bending over backwards to make sure that they are treating him more than fairly. So that could be what's going on. Look, $400 and whatever million is a lot of money. You can accept that somebody maybe doesn't have that cash on hand. I think the underlying issue here, though, is that he does not have the value in his properties. He doesn't have the collateral to support. Look, a bond is nothing more than kind of a loan. It's a fancy loan that's designed for the criminal justice system. In this sense, it's kind of like when you post a bond to get out of jail before trial. Well, this is posting a bond so you keep going while your case is pending appeal. So it's kind of the same thing, right? And a bond is just a loan made by a bond company that intends to make a lot of money off of it, and so that you don't have to post the full amount in cash. But you got to put up something. You got to put up your house. You got to put up your valuable property. What I think this is all showing is he doesn't have the value. He is not worth enough for anybody to give him that loan, that bond. And again, the courts are just bending over backwards to make sure that it looks like he's being treated fairly, when no other criminal defendant in 30 years of practice have I ever seen gotten that kind of consideration.
Well, there you have it. Your experience speaks for itself. I can only imagine what Letitia James thinks about all of this, because if Donald Trump doesn't have the money, there is potentially another answer, and that is this SPAC deal that's about to happen. And Bloomberg just now is reporting that Trump Media and the folks he's working with are set to begin trading. This is the Truth Social SPAC. March 26th, that's tomorrow, DJT and DJT WW are going to be the ticker symbols. We knew this was coming, of course, Robert. The problem is Donald Trump can't actually get that money without special approval until a lockup period ends down the road. He could, however, borrow against that as collateral, I suppose, because you pointed out something interesting. If they start seizing properties here, he's already got debt against those properties, right? So how do you value them?
Well, you have to take a look at how much liens are on those properties. And so the first thing is Donald Trump slaps his name on a lot of properties. That doesn't mean he owns the majority interests in those properties. In many cases, he might own a little bit more than the sign that's on the front of the building. I mean, he doesn't necessarily own the whole building, right? Then what he owns, he has also borrowed in order to make another purchase. So it's this little kind of domino thing that he's got going. And I've seen many clients with that happens. What happens eventually is one of the properties goes bad, and then the dominoes all start to fall backwards, and somebody's charged with a crime. Well, the event here was basically a criminal charge, and after a very long deliberative process, found that Donald Trump and his organization is a fraud. And now you got to go back and see if there's any value in all these properties, when in reality, he inflated all those values when he wanted to get loans, and then he deflated the values when he had to pay taxes. So he's defrauded the taxpayers in doing this. And frankly, if I can just go on here, I think a point needs to be made about where the injury is to people. Donald Trump and his team have made this big claim that, hey, all these deals went through, the banks made money, there's no victims. Well, that's not really true. Donald Trump, by making fraudulent loan applications, has taken money out of the system that would have otherwise gone to valid loan applications. So if you own a restaurant, let's say in Manhattan, and you want to add a dining room and you need to go get a loan to do it, you make a valid loan application, you show your assets, and the bank decides whether you're a good risk to loan money to, right? Well, right now that money isn't there because Donald Trump took it when he made a false loan application. And that's what's so important about this Attorney General's case, because you've got to maintain the validity of the system in order to make sure people are treated fairly when they go in for their loan applications. That's the damage to people, and that's the damage to the system.
We're spending time with attorney Robert McWhirter on Balance of Power. And Robert, as I'm listening to you, we are getting some insight as to what is happening inside the courtroom in New York now. This is, of course, Alvin Bragg's case, the hush money case against Donald Trump that had been delayed. This was supposed to be the first day of the trial, in fact. Now it's a hearing that will likely establish a new date. It had been delayed because of a big dump of evidence that fell on the case a couple of weeks back. Here we go, Robert. This is breaking news right now. April 15, the judge is speaking as I talk to you. The U.S. Attorney's Office is not under the district attorney's control. He says the Manhattan District Attorney's Office did due diligence. This defendant will not suffer any reasonable prejudice because he has received enough time. The judge says jury selection will begin on April 15th. Robert, what do you think?
Well, here's what's going on here. The Trump team had made a request of the U.S. attorneys, the federal U.S. attorneys, the federal prosecutors, for their information on this case. And the federal prosecutors then turned that over to the state prosecutors, Bragg's team, and then they turned it over to the Trump team. Now, this information is pretty much redundant to what the Trump team already had from the state prosecutors. But Trump's team used that as an excuse to go into court and accuse Bragg of withholding evidence when the evidence wasn't even in his hands, and then arguing that they should get a continuance in order to deal with all this evidence, the vast majority of which I would think is nothing more than redundant to what they already had from the state case. So once again, you have to look at, there's trial tactics, but then there's the overall strategy here. Donald Trump's overall strategy is to delay, delay, delay. Every case is a delay.
That's right.
And then he thinks he's going to become president and he'll get them all dismissed or he'll be beyond.
Well, is there a way for him to delay this now, Robert? We have April 15th. And if I want to make sure our listeners and viewers understand if they're just joining us, this is breaking news now. The first criminal trial of a former president is set now to begin April 15th. Number one, does he have a chance to delay it? And Robert, knowing this would be a 6-week trial, that would allow ample room for Jack Smith to conduct his trial should the Supreme Court allow him, right?
Yes, absolutely. I think what's going on is things are finally coming to a head. Now, these cases were all filed before Donald Trump was ever a candidate. So his claims that this is all politically motivated, et cetera, are just wrong, that the facts don't bear that out. It is kind of coming to a head. People are finally trying to get these cases to come to resolution, despite Trump's work to delay them all. And that's where we are now. I do not see anything coming up at this point that would delay the April 15th trial. And so now it's time for Donald Trump to face the music. You know, I'll make another quick point here. You know, Donald Trump keeps talking about everything being a witch hunt, et cetera. Well, if that's the case, he should be asking for his jury as soon as possible. He should be saying, I want my trial right now because I want to show how this is a witch hunt and how I'm innocent. No, he doesn't do that. What he does is he wants to avoid the jury. He wants to avoid the court. And meanwhile makes these political arguments that it's a witch hunt when it's nothing of the sort. If it truly is a witch hunt, then we go and protect that with a jury of our peers in America. That's how we do it in America.
Well, we've got a redhead on the terminal. People's phones are buzzing around the country right now, around the world, who subscribe to Bloomberg. Trump's hush money trial date now set for April 15th, according to the judge. This happening just a moment ago. And if Donald Trump speaks, we will bring you some remarks. I suspect he did speak on the way in, and there's a fair chance that he will on the way out here. This is a former president of the United States now set for criminal trial. And based on what we're hearing from Robert McWhirter here, it's unlikely that he will have any further opportunity to delay this case. So that's going to be one trial, Robert, that takes place before the election of 2024.
I don't see how that's avoidable. I think that's going to happen now.
In terms of the Supreme Court, there will be arguments heard on April 25th when it comes to the presidential immunity question. That would likely then mean a ruling at some point from the court in June, maybe late June, maybe the last thing they do before they walk out the door here. In that world, that leaves enough time for a second trial, in this case, Jack Smith's trial?
Yes. You know, what I find interesting about that is Donald Trump on Truth Social, I think it was just last night or the night before, was saying that Joe Biden should be prosecuted for his witch hunt and all that kind of stuff for what he's doing. But if you take Trump's own arguments in the presidential immunity case, then Joe Biden shouldn't be prosecuted for anything while he acts as president. Donald Trump is claiming the president should have these broad powers to do anything in office. Well, if that's the case, then Joe Biden should not be prosecuted for anything, even though I think Trump's claims are outlandish. But he's defeating his own arguments, quite frankly, by making those kinds of statements. What's going on with the Supreme Court is interesting. I don't see how they're going to give Donald Trump this broad immunity that he's asking for. The case precedent is the case that happened in the United States versus Nixon. And what I think the court is going to do is they gave Trump the win on the Colorado case, but I don't think they're going to give him the win on that. And the court under John Roberts is very concerned, especially Chief Justice Roberts, about maintaining the court's legitimacy as an institution. And this is their way to do it, is to maintain that legitimacy by finding against the president, which is really what the law should dictate anyway. So that would be my prediction of what's going to go on with that.
Spoken from a man who literally wrote the book on the 14th Amendment. Robert, I'm glad we could talk today. How could we have imagined what we would experience here together? I'm glad you joined us. Robert McWhirter, criminal attorney, Slate & Roebuck, and he's got his own office as well, having spent, to his point, 30 years doing this. The bond has been reduced by more than 2/3. We'll find out if he can pay it. And we have a trial date now, April 15th. That's the Alvin Bragg case. Both of these issues resolved this Monday morning in New York with the echo chamber here in Washington. I'm Joe Matthew, and speaking of which, we'll have a lot more on this. Our panel will be here a little later in the hour to react to what we have learned here together today. Aren't you glad you tuned in at high noon? That's why you take this show live on the lunch break. We'll talk about what happened over the weekend in Congress. No shutdown next, only on Bloomberg.
Today, I'm going to talk about how to succeed with a startup. Obviously, more than can be said here in 20 minutes, but I will do the best I can. The most important thing, the number one lesson we try to teach startups is that the degree to which you're successful approximates the degree to which you build a product that is so good, people spontaneously tell their friends about it. Startups always ask us for the secret to success. They always want to believe it's something other than this, because this is really hard to do. But this is it. If you can build a product that is so good, people spontaneously tell their friends about it, you have done 80% of the work that you need to be a really successful startup. If you think about the most successful companies you know, Google, Facebook, whatever, you probably found out about them because a friend of yours said, you got to try this, it's great. So this is the bar. Something that people love so much they tell their friends about it. One important indicator for a product like that is a product that's simple to explain and easy to understand. If you can't explain in a few words what you do, and if at least some people don't say, oh, that's pretty interesting, that's usually a mistake. It's usually a sign of unclear thinking or a need that is not big enough.
I want a bank that shows me what I spend instantly. We're Monzo. Give us a go.
See? Well, I want a bank that can help me budget for the things I need. Like a new leather jacket for Bingo.
We can do that.
Bingo's my cockapoo.
Hi, Bingo.
It's a real faff to sign up.
It takes less than 10 minutes.
Race you.
You're on. Time's up. How'd you get on?
It's a draw.
Is it? We hear you, Bingo. You make Monzo Monzo.
The shares of Boeing right now, they have turned higher on the news that those two are leaving, up right now 1.6%. Apple, Alphabet, Google, Meta platforms facing the risk of potentially hefty fines. The European Union has opened a full-blown investigation into the firm's compliance with new laws reining in the power of big tech. Best performing stock in the S&P 500 right now, Super Microcomputer, up close to 9% in today's trading. Overall, the S&P 500 down 8 points. That's down just about 0.2%. We're at 52.26 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average 112 points lower. That's down about 0.3%. The Nasdaq 100 40 points lower. That is down 0.2%. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Balance of Power continues, and on top of all this breaking news, you are in good hands with Joe Matthew.
That's awfully nice of you, John Tucker. Great to have you from New York. And we'll be back with John a little bit later this hour to get an update on trading. It has been a day already. What are we at, 12:23 here? Just think what else could happen. Actually, we have a sense of what else might happen with the moment of truth for Donald Trump, whether he can pay a now severely reduced bond in the civil trial in New York. But we did get, just before you might have joined us, a trial date. This is the hush money case, Alvin Bragg's case. The first criminal trial of a former president. Jury selection will begin April 15th. Donald Trump was in the courtroom for this hearing today. If he does speak now, he talked on the way in. If he does speak a little bit later on, we'll bring you his remarks live here on Balance of Power. Government's open. Wasn't sure I'd be able to say that today. Remember when a weekend shutdown was inevitable? Maybe something longer? It all came together at the end of last week. You know, when we talk to Billy House and Jonathan Samari about this, they never say, oh yeah, we're about to shut down. They always bring a voice of reason, reminding us that usually this works out in the end, and it did again. So we're good through September 30th, even though the speaker was not able to leave Washington without a motion to vacate from Marjorie Taylor Greene. Friday was something, huh? I'm still rebuilding it in my head. And so we have Billy House and Jonathan Samari with us, two of Bloomberg's best, covering Capitol Hill to figure out what just happened and what might come next, because we're not done. Billy House, of course, Bloomberg News. Jonathan Samari at Bloomberg Government, the Power Panel. Great to see you guys both with us. Happy Monday. Welcome back. Billy's sitting right next to me, so I'm going to start with you. You did tell me. No. They usually pull this out at the last minute. Did Mike Johnson know that?
I don't know if he did, but I knew that they had a 2-week break coming up, and they didn't want to ruin that.
That's all it ever comes down to.
So they had to scramble to get all this done before they left for their stumping and campaigning and parades.
They call it the district work period.
Oh, right. I forgot. Thank you.
Okay, so you answered my question. I mean, are they working? What are they doing at home?
In all fairness, I spent just a couple weeks ago a week out in New Mexico in the district there, and they do work. This was Gabe Vasquez. That's a huge district from Albuquerque down to the border, and 270 miles separates some of the main points there. And he worked like a dog. I got to give him credit for that.
Well, I guess that's or they're going on Codels, or I guess
some of them do
holding events or whatever that recess includes. Jonathan Tamari, it's great to have you. We didn't shut down. I think you also tempered my attitude on this whole thing last week. So congrats on that. I'm just trying to figure out what comes next here. What was it like for Speaker Johnson to leave, for lawmakers to leave town just hours after Marjorie Taylor Greene dropped a motion to vacate and starting this whole thing all over again?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's next is obviously going to be we think is going to be next is the foreign aid bill that's been stalled for so long that the Senate passed and the House has not taken up. And as you point out, Marjorie Taylor Greene kind of left this ticking time bomb there to see what will happen. But the sense right now, at least, is that there's not an appetite among most Republicans to go back through the process they already went through late last year, where they spent weeks trying to replace the House Speaker. We saw from that process, it's very hard to find someone who can win over all of the Republican caucus virtually, and they're losing members to retirement. There's even a threat if they unseat Mike Johnson that Hakeem Jeffries could potentially become Speaker the way that the numbers are dwindling. So I don't think most Republicans want to go down that road again. I doubt we're going to see it, but as you've pointed out, it's a pretty unpredictable, tenuous situation this Congress.
Well, boy, that's for sure. Billy, the matter of Ukraine is what I guess is going to bring us to a head on all of these issues. Really interesting conversations over the weekend on Face the Nation. Michael McCall, and I hadn't heard this anywhere else, said Mike Johnson has committed to putting a Ukraine bill on the floor after Easter.
Yes.
Okay, well, that's a pretty big deal. That's the trigger for the motion to vacate. And as I say that now, some of the other talk that we heard over the weekend, Chip Roy tells CNN, I promise you put a Ukraine bill on the floor and you've not secured the border, there is going to be a problem within the ranks on Capitol Hill. Could this speaker still get fired?
Well, on paper he could, but let's remember that Marjorie Taylor Greene is not a member of the House Freedom Caucus. She got kicked out. So there's not necessarily that group of lawmakers all in total following her. But she only needs, because of the very narrow majority that Johnson has, she really only needs two colleagues, Republican colleagues, to join her. If all Democrats vote and either vote present or vote not to block that. So there's also a question about whether some Democrats would cross party lines and help Johnson. But whatever, that's all the undercurrent to this Ukraine bill.
Yes.
And he's got to walk gingerly, whatever he does.
Is it true that, and we've heard this from a lot of lawmakers, you bring it to the floor, it'll pass? He's got the numbers for that bill if he actually brought it to a vote.
I think he does, if you count members from both parties.
Yes, with Democrats.
It's more the repercussions of what happens if he does do that.
That says everything right now, doesn't it, about Washington?
It is.
Jonathan Tamari, you're writing about the margin here, and pretty remarkable to see what's going on in this House. We're going to be in a world, now that Mike Gallagher has stepped down, or is stepping down and leaving the building early, this is chair of the China Select Committee, he's going to have a margin of 1?
Yeah, he's going to be able to lose 1 vote in order to pass anything on a party line basis. And if he loses 2 votes, it's not going to pass if it's a party line bill. And we've seen this functionally, throughout this Congress. Even when Republicans had a 2, 3, 4 vote margin, they still were relying on Democrats for pretty much every major piece of legislation, because there is a flank of their party that will not vote for almost anything unless it's exactly what they want. And which is not going to happen as long as the Senate is controlled by Democrats. So functionally, we still have a situation where anything significant is going to need Democratic support. And there doesn't seem to be a lot more that's going to be able to get done as we get near an election, other than maybe this foreign aid bill and a few other kind of must-pass bills. I don't think there's much hope for anything of serious ambition getting through the House.
How do you have a majority with one? I don't understand how you operate as a speaker. How does Mike Johnson do anything then?
Well, first of all, you got to hope nobody gets sick.
Well, that's right.
and then you got to realize that you kind of self-destructed on your own. You started out the year with only really a 4-vote margin, and your party dumped George Santos, and he lost his seat to a Democrat, and your party got rid of the Speaker, McCarthy, and his seat still hasn't been filled. So there's some self-destructive part to this, too.
It's incredible. As we spend time with Billy House and Jonathan Tamari, both covering Congress, one for Bloomberg News, the other Bloomberg Government. Jonathan, you've got a great story out today about New Jersey, and I know that this is your former stomping ground, so I'd love to hear from you on this. Representative Andy Kim, pretty amazing here, might be able to actually win this seat now that Tammy Murphy is dropping out of the race. This is the Democratic primary in New Jersey. Tammy Murphy stunning the party on this. Did you see it coming?
I did not see it coming. I think a lot of people had started to come around to the idea that Andy Kim was the favorite to become the nominee in that primary. And this, of course, is the race to replace Bob Menendez, who's facing those kind of incredible bribery charges right now. Tammy Murphy was supposed to be the steamroller. She's the governor's wife. She had all the support of the biggest insiders in New Jersey politics, and that is typically the way that Democratic primaries are won in New Jersey. That's historically been the way they've been won. But Andy Kim, who's a congressman from outside Philadelphia, ran his own campaign. There was a lot of grassroots energy that was disgusted by the Menendez situation and kind of turned that energy against Tammy Murphy as well, seeing the kind of insider politics that was supporting her. And now that she's dropped out, Kim is almost certain to be the next senator. New Jersey hasn't elected a Republican since the 1970s. But what's even more interesting is that Kim has a lawsuit going that would change the ballot structure in New Jersey, which is really the source of the power of New Jersey's machine politics. And if his lawsuit succeeds, that would resonate well beyond his own race this year and could really overhaul all of politics in New Jersey and undercut the machines that dominate there. So it's a fascinating situation.
Amazing.
This court case is something we really need to watch.
The line, as they call it. I learned that in reading your story, Jonathan. Great reporting. Of course, this is the First Lady, Tammy Murphy, we're talking about, in a significant development here. Billy House, when are they back? 2 weeks? That'll be 2 weeks and change, I figure.
Exactly.
After April Fool's Day.
Right. Just in time to let things kind of marinate in terms of Ukraine and any motion to vacate. Also, it's primary season. It gets into full swing, so things at home.
Right, so it gets back to the home district work period.
Absolutely.
With Billy House and Jonathan Tamari, great to have both of you here. It's Monday as we look to the future and bring you up to date on world and national news. Right now, Nancy Lyons is back with us in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Hey, Joe. Donald Trump has been given a lifeline on that $454 million bond that was to be paid today in his New York civil fraud judgment. A New York appeals court has agreed to slash the amount of the bond to $175 million, with the due date now in another 10 days. Trump thanked the judge for the reduction and the extension. He says he will make the payment by the new deadline. Also, just a short time ago, a judge ruled that the hush money case against Trump, the first criminal trial for the former president, will begin April 15th with jury selection. Ukrainian authorities say Russia is stepping up its attacks on Kyiv, with authorities saying on Telegram 2 ballistic missiles were intercepted today over the capital. Kyiv's mayor says the sports hall was damaged and also 10 people were injured. Well, this week marks 1 year since Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich was arrested in Russia on charges of spying. The U.S. calls it a wrongful detainment. Ella Gershkovich spoke with ABC News about the administration's promise to bring him home.
You know that the U.S. government is taking Evan's case very seriously, so we are optimistic.
Ella Gershkovich says her son is able to reach out to them periodically. For the first time since the Israel-Hamas war began, the UN is demanding a ceasefire in Gaza during the holy month of Ramadan. The U.S. was the only abstention.
14 votes in favor, 0 vote against, 1 abstention.
Global News, 24 hours a day.
Hey, and I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom. This Bloomberg Business Flash. The major stock averages modestly lower. Intel slipping on a report that China is limiting the use of foreign chips. The Intel shares right now down 1.7%. And then you have Boeing. They're rising those shares after announcing its chief will step down. You have Treasury 10-year yields rising about 5 basis points before a record sale of 2-year notes, $66 billion that's worth. Traders are, to some degree, waiting for the next big data point. This week's going to bring the Federal Reserve's preferred inflation measure, the PCE price index. That comes on Friday when markets are actually closed for Good Friday. Meantime, Jim Bianco at Bianco Research is wondering if the present course set by the Federal Reserve is actually a good idea.
Is this a good idea for the Fed to be cutting rates? Because if they're not careful, they could cut rates. And if the bond market's thinking that they're unserious about inflation, we could wind up with higher yields, not lower yields.
S&P 500 earnings estimates through the fourth quarter of next year have stayed stable or even risen slightly the past few weeks after consistently falling since the start of the year. That could bode well for the major averages. Right now, the S&P 500 10 points lower. That's down 0.2%. Dow Jones Industrial Average is 125 points lower. That is down 0.3%. And the Nasdaq Composite Index 30 points lower. That is down 0.2%. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker in for the peripatetic Charlie Pellet. And Balance of Power continues with Joe Matthew.
You can't use that word on the subway. John, thank you. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, where we're now waiting to hear from Donald Trump. The former president has had quite a day already and has more to come. If you're just joining us, pretty remarkable to learn that the first criminal trial of a former president has now been scheduled for tax day. It's going to be April 15th. That's jury selection. That was determined in a courtroom in New York earlier this hour. We found out about it together. We are expecting to hear now from Donald Trump in just minutes' time. And of course, we'll bring you his remarks when he speaks there, expected to do so from the courthouse. We are also waiting to hear if he can post bond in a separate case. This is the New York civil trial, where there is also news. A $454 million ruling. Remember this? He had to post bond, and there were questions about whether he had enough money to do it. Letitia James standing by to seize properties if he cannot. Well, that number was reduced by more than 2/3 today to $175 million. It is still unclear if he can pay that, but we'll find out today, as it turns out. Our panel is now with us. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Our signature panel as we wait to hear from the former president. And I can only imagine, Rick Davis, what he is going to have to say today. The news has been mixed, I guess we can call it. He's got the lower bond, but also a court date that he was seeking to delay even further. By the time we're done here today, is this a good or a bad one for Donald Trump?
You know, it's kind of hard to really space out what the different advantages and disadvantages is. I mean, he's made incredibly good use of this judgment over the weekend. He's been on social media nonstop all through the night. They're taking away Trump Tower. They're seizing my assets. It's horrible. Send me money right away. And so now he's going to probably walk out and say, see, I got him down to a reasonable number. But like, is 150 million, 175 million?
175.
Is that a reasonable number? I mean, like, what's he going to say about that? It all sounds bad to me, but he makes so many bad things sound good that it's very hard to determine what he's going to say today. But I'm sure he'll lash out at the judge and lash out at being, you know, sort of put in this position in general. But no, all we know for sure is that he's going to blame a lot of other people for his problems and declare victory.
I suspect that is what will happen. The former president, will be speaking from 40 Wall Street just moments from now. Jeannie, I can only imagine that you expect something similar to Rick. We had heard earlier this hour from an attorney, Robert McWhirter, who said never in his 30-year career has he seen the system bend the knee to accommodate a criminal defendant. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, and of course, he knows better being in this system. I think it's fair to say that Donald Trump has gotten so many advantages from the justice system that all of us, if we were in this position, wouldn't have enjoyed. But, as much as he benefited from the reduction by about, 2/3 of the bond payment, we now have the presumptive nominee on trial in a criminal case in a matter of 20 days, followed a couple days later by an important decision from the Supreme Court on immunity. And most legal experts expect that they will go against the president on that because, of course, the idea that, Joe Biden could kill somebody tomorrow and be immune for that is outrageous. And so he finally is seeing all of this catch up to him. And as you look politically, as much as he's going to claim, and he will when he makes this announcement or his press conference in a few minutes, that he is a victim of the justice system, he's benefited from the justice system. And more importantly, how many fence sitters, voters in the middle who like Trump policies are going to want somebody who is either criminally convicted or on trial to be the next president of the United States? That is a tough sell. So I don't care who you are. It is a bad day for Donald Trump with this 15th day set.
Well, it seems that you both agree on that. Rick, it's been suggested repeatedly over the past couple of days that if Letitia James, if the state begins seizing Trump properties, that would help to turn public opinion in his favor, that the optics around that would fulfill the idea of weaponizing government, that they're targeting this man. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, to some degree. He'll certainly make incredibly good use of his assets being seized. He's a man of assets, right? I mean, like 90% of what we know about Donald Trump are buildings. And so the idea that the state is going to take his buildings away. I mean, this kind of seizure, it runs deep in America, right? And so, there have been many political grassroots campaigns against government seizure of personal assets. And so I think, it gives him an opportunity to really be a bellicose populist and talk about how the state's aligned against him. And if they do it to him, of course they're going to do it to you. He's a powerful ex-president, and, it shows you the disdain that he has for the establishment, and all his supporters will get excited about that. The people who are celebrating this seizure potential, I think, don't quite understand the way he will be able to play it. Doesn't mean it's the wrong thing to do. It's just a reality of once you go down this track of these prosecutions, you could end up, in this place, and you could end up actually giving him some political benefit in the process.
What's your take on this, Jeannie? We do know Donald Trump has said already that he could only afford $100 million or less in this case. It's partly why they were asking for a smaller number, because he'd have to sell properties at a loss, he said, to raise cash. It's now 175. If he can't pay it and they start seizing properties in Westchester County, does that play to Trump's favor?
We heard over the weekend, of course, he went back and forth on this. He has the money. He doesn't have the money, his lawyers say. So it's hard. We don't really know what he has. I think Letitia James, if she does start down this path, which she said she will, it's not going to be that she's going to go running to Trump Tower and put a sign on the door, state property. She will go after his bank accounts first, and it is a slow, drawn-out process. But I do think, his supporters will certainly stick with him. We know that. But this election, as we think politically, is not going to be won or lost by his supporters. It's going to be won or lost in the moderate middle. And the reality is, what happened in New York is not a victimless crime. I am a New York resident. When he did what he did by increasing his, reducing the amount that he said he was worth in the property for tax purposes, but increasing it to get loans. All those other people who wanted loans were kept out of that system. So it's not a victimless crime, and she should have pursued it, and she did. And so he's going to have to pay the consequences there. So, I think in the middle, it's going to depend on where independents outside of New York, where this is playing big, where they come down. And I do think that's a problem for Joe Biden, because both of these cases being in New York are not the national cases of the documents or January 6th that are so important for people across the country, arguably more so.
Boy. So who's his audience today, other than this sort of vague MAGA thing, Rick? He's not talking to people in New York, is he?
No, New York is pretty irrelevant to him. As Jeannie says, he'll stoke up the base because he loves doing that. And it's going to be a lot of conversation with donors. They have a serious financial problem at the campaign. I mean, we talk all about Donald Trump and his personal finances, but the RNC is broke. His campaigns are on thin air, money-wise, and the super PACs aren't getting any flow of capital that has any meaning in competition with the Democrats. So he may use this as a major effort to try and launch a fundraising campaign around it, because at this stage, he's not going to worry as much about the election votes, because we've got the summer months to work through and consolidate the party and go to the conventions. This is all about raising money. And I think the audience today are donors.
Fascinating. Would that work? Jeannie, when does this stop working? He's leveraged multiple courtrooms to his financial advantage. Now that we're actually leaning into a criminal trial, do people stop opening their wallets? Because we know that this campaign is having a lot of trouble bleeding money at the outset of the longest general election campaign in modern history.
Yeah, I think people will still open their wallets. We know that they have not as much as they had in the past, certainly amongst small donors. But the reality is all of that money is going to be going, or most of it will go to pay these lawyers. And so you've got to ask, how much do people want to do that? And I'll tell you who I feel horrible for as you think about this is the Republicans down ballot, who also depend on the RNC, who it looks like today is going to be funneling most of this money into Donald Trump's legal bills. So, can he do this and do it to his advantage? I'm not going to say no, because I've said no in the past and he's done it. But, if you're a betting person running for president while you're in the midst of criminal cases, over 91 felony counts, not a good idea generally. And so you've got to say, the luck's gonna run out at some point when people say, hey, what about me? I want a president who can do my bidding, not be looking back and trying to protect himself.
Yeah, right. Spending time with Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, our signature panel, I'm glad to say, in place on this Monday as we stand by to hear from Donald Trump. Any moment now he could emerge. Microphones have been set up with a line of American flags at the courthouse where the former president has learned that jury selection in his trial, this is the Alvin Bragg, Stormy Daniels hush money trial, will begin on April 15th. If you're with us on YouTube, you see a live view of the courthouse here. That's where reporters have been assembled. The cameras and the microphones are in place, and so when the former president comes out, of course, we'll be bringing that to you. If you had a glimpse of that, it looks a little bit more formal than some of the lobby shots that we've seen. The president kind of just yelling at people as he's walking through the lobby on his way into the courtroom. This will have a bit more of a campaign feel to it. And Rick, I'm guessing this is all good politics for Donald Trump, right? This is what has worked so far.
So far, he's got to consider this a successful way of using these trials as a platform. I would say this Bragg trial, the one that starts on the 15th, I think that's his most problematic trial. It is actually about election tampering. It kind of undercuts his argument that the elections were stolen in 2020 when he was actually trying to undercut the elections in 2016. It's embarrassing because it involves, having sex with a porn star and lying about it. And you've got the star witness being his former fixer, who, has got a story to tell. And that's a story that is very unflattering, especially if you're a woman, Republican, suburban voter with a family. This is not what you want to be reminded of, and this is not what Donald Trump wants the world to be reminded of about his escapades.
If you're just joining us here on Bloomberg Radio, and on YouTube. We do have breaking news as we wait to hear from Donald Trump. He's going to be speaking from the courthouse in New York after the start of his trial was set for April 15th, also now facing a far lower bond payment in the separate civil trial that Letitia James has been pursuing, and we'll have more on that later. It is unclear that he will make this $175 million payment, but it is down 68% from the prior number that we had. We'll, of course, bring you the former president when he does speak, but we also want to keep you up to date on what's been happening inside the courtroom, Jeannie. Apparently, he did have a few brief words with reporters and said he would appeal this case, claiming that Alvin Bragg does not want to try the case. Say what you will about that latter part, but an appeal would be expected in anything that Donald Trump is involved in that doesn't play out in his favor, right?
That's right, and that is what we've seen. And of course, even before we get, a conviction or we get an acquittal, he's talking about appeal. That's what he's always done. This is part of his delay tactic, which again we have to say so far has worked in his favor and very well may continue to. I think the reality here is that the judge said, we gave you your 30 days. You had that. There was nothing in that material that warranted putting this off any further. So we are going to go ahead. We're looking at probably 6 weeks. And boy, is it going to be a soap opera-ish 6 weeks between, as Rick mentioned, Michael Cohen, Stormy Daniels, Alvin Bragg, Donald Trump. I mean, these are characters right out of a movie, for gosh sakes.
Well, this will probably be a movie at some point. Rick, you know what it's like when politics somehow finds its way onto the big screen. But I'll tell you what, the first draft of history is frequently more interesting. There have been a lot of questions about the way news organizations cover Donald Trump, Rick, and we're going to go into this again with roadblock coverage of Donald Trump standing at microphones, and then there will be questions about how long we should be listening to him when he starts saying things that are not true. Is this going to confound the news media for the rest of the campaign?
Sure. This is the hardest man in the history of American politics to cover. You feel like you have a compelling reason and need to give equal time to the Republican candidate since, you have a president who's a Democrat candidate. And it's extraordinarily difficult because it's not like you can just give him an open mic and realize that he's going to be responsible and tell the truth, or at least even his spin version of the truth. Instead, he will tell you things, the American public, that are simply not true at all, have been debunked many times. And yet he does it in a fashion that you think, maybe he's right. Maybe there's something there. He is a salesman par excellence. And so it's an extremely difficult decision for media outlets to play up. And we saw even some of that in a much lesser degree with the immense amount of anxiety at NBC by just giving a contract to the former chairman of the RNC, Ronna McDaniel, and the backlash that occurred within that news organization over the idea that someone close to Donald Trump would be put in a position to, quote, talk about the news. And so I think this is going to be one, exactly what you said. This is much more interesting than any nonfiction or a fiction story that you could write. This is making history because we've never seen a political campaign play out in state courts like this and federal courts all around the country. And nobody knows how this is going to impact the electorate long term.
Jeannie, we've got less than a minute left here. Donald Trump is about to speak to the nation. Will he speak any truths that we should listen to?
It's hard to tell. I would have to say probably not. But I think what we know he is going to say is he has been victimized, that he is, standing in for all of his supporters who have equally been victimized by a system that not only doesn't work, but works against them. And he is prepared to meet the moment by fighting back in a way they cannot. That's why they love him. Right. And I suspect we'll hear more of that.
Jeannie, thank you. And Rick will be back with us in hour 2 as we provide our coverage, and stand by to hear from Donald Trump here on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington as we add Kaylee Lines to the conversation coming up next, here only on Bloomberg. Donald Trump will become the first former president to stand for criminal trial beginning April 15th. Welcome to the fastest show in politics. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington with several points of breaking news today that are going to help us dictate the future of Donald Trump's legal life. Kaylee, happy Monday. We have had a court date dropped on us today, April 15th, and in a separate trial, the civil case against Donald Trump, a much, much lower bond payment than he thought he would need to pay.
$175 million is the gift, if you will, that the appeals court gave him. He initially was on the hook to, by today, either pay $454 million because of the civil suit that the Attorney General Letitia James brought against him, or post a bond for 120% of that amount. He was unable to do so, according to filings. All of the companies he went to would not take his building as collateral, so now he has 10 days to pay that smaller amount. So that may be the good news in the many legal battles that the former president is facing we got today. The bad news, though, of course, comes in the fact that his attempts to delay his criminal trial in the Alvin Bragg hush money case have not worked. He will be going to trial April 15th. That's when the judge says jury selection will begin.
Yeah, that's exactly right. On tax day, and it's pretty amazing to think how this could play out. He was in the courtroom for this earlier today, Kaylee. He didn't have anything to say, at least on the record. He did, I guess, speak with reporters on the way out, saying that he would appeal the case and that Alvin Bragg doesn't want to try this anyway. But jury selection, and there were some pretty stern words from the judge, is going to begin on April 15th. The question remains, can Donald Trump pay this bond in the other trial that we're watching? We get into this space, though, where there are so many headlines and so much noise. Sometimes we forget the significance of the fact that this will be the first criminal trial of a former president.
It's going to be absolutely historic, and it's worth keeping in mind when we consider the timeline here. If this goes to trial April 15th, just 10 days later, the Supreme Court will be hearing arguments in the immunity case he has brought, arguing he is immune from prosecution in the case brought against him by Jack Smith here in Washington related to 2020 election subversion. So the timeline is going to get much trickier here, depending on whether or not he is getting through this trial. Is another trial maybe getting set to begin? Certainly very complicated for the former president.
Well, you made the point earlier. That means that's going to happen right in the middle of the Bragg trial. Right. This is going to be a wild month for politics because they all are now, Kaylee. But we'll have much more to follow, including the former president's remarks. Kaylee, we are expecting to hear from Donald Trump.
That's right.
They've set up the microphones and the flags like you would see for a traditional sort of campaign event with the president. Inside the courthouse, we'll bring you the remarks as soon as he begins talking. As we add the voice now of Jim Zirin, you can see the courtroom as we wait for him. Former Assistant U.S. Attorney, Southern District of New York, with us now. Jim, this is pretty significant, obviously, the first criminal trial of a former president. And we thank you for being with us here in the clutch, and we will be hearing from Donald Trump imminently. He says he will appeal. Is there any way he can move that date at this point, or that's set in stone?
You mean the date for his appeal?
April 15th.
He has the April 15th trial. He might move in the appellate division to, or he might take an appeal from Judge Merchan's order setting the trial date.
All right. Jim, I apologize. I need to interrupt you now. We'd love for you to stay with us as Donald Trump approaches the microphones. Let's bring this to our listeners and viewers live on Bloomberg.
So, a lot of things happened today. This is all about election interference. This is all Biden-run things, meaning Biden and his thugs, because I don't know if he knows he's alive. And it's a shame. It's a shame what's happening to our country. This is election interference. They are doing things that have never been done in this country before. We've never had anything like it, certainly not at this level, but we've really had nothing like it that I've been able to find. It does happen a lot in third world countries, banana republics. If you look at what we just left, you have a case which they're dying to get this thing started. The judge cannot go faster. He wants to get it started so badly. And there's tremendous corruption. You have Pomerantz, Mark Pomerantz. He was Hillary Clinton's lawyer, or Democrat National Committee's lawyer. He worked in Paul Weiss. He walked in and he took over the district attorney's office. Nobody's ever seen anything like that, to prosecute Trump. And then they wouldn't do what he wanted to do, and he goes out and he writes a book. Long before any decisions were made, he writes a book about it. And the book gets published, and everybody's reading his book. And the judge said there's nothing wrong with that. And if you look at Bragg had a fit over that. Bragg said this trial is now dead. We can't do the trial. Well, that was one of the problems, and the judge should have allowed that to happen. And you had other instances like Colangelo. Colangelo is a radical left from the DOJ who was put into the state, working with Letitia James, and then was put into the district attorney's office to run the trial against Trump. And that was done by Biden and his thugs also, because they can't win an election because of the borders, because of energy prices, because of inflation, because of Afghanistan, the worst and most embarrassing day in the history of our country. He can't win because of Russia, because of all the problems, because of Ukraine being attacked by Russia. And he can't win because of the October 7th attack of Israel, which he should have never allowed to happen, would have never happened if I were president. Ukraine would have never been attacked if I was president. And you wouldn't have inflation if I was president. We didn't have inflation. So all of these things, so what they do is they do election interference, which is court cases, and let's try and tie him up, and let's take as much of his money as possible. I respect the appellate division for substantially reducing that ridiculous amount of money that was put on by a corrupt judge named Engoron. He ought to be looked at, seriously looked at, especially what he did with valuations. He's the one, he's a fraudulent valuator, where he values Mar-a-Lago at $18 million, and people say it's worth 50 to 100 times that much, the biggest experts in the business. So he ought to be looked at, and James ought to be looked at, because she tried to get him. She's like the puppet master of the judge. And, you know, our state, this state, is losing tremendous prestige. It's losing its companies. It's losing its people. They're fleeing, and violent crime is flourishing. And we can't have that. We can't have that. No city should have that. And it's happening in other cities, but not with the lawfare. The lawfare that they're doing is incredible. So they could have done this in the case of the trial that we just left, one of the many that are going. Every single one of them is run by Biden and his thugs. It's the only way they think they can get elected. And I think so far it's backfiring, because the people of this country understand it. It's backfiring. But they're being run, and they're running all of these different cases. So ridiculous, the cases. Every one of them is ridiculous. You take a look at any one of them, and you say any one of them, it wouldn't make any difference. This is all weaponization of DOJ and FBI. They raided my house in violation of a thing called the Fourth Amendment. Not allowed to do that. They raided my house in Florida, Mar-a-Lago. No notice, no nothing. They raided it. I can't believe it. Nobody can believe it. And we'll see how that all works out in the end. But it's illegal what they're doing. It's criminal what they're doing. And it's never been done before in this country. You can't have an election in the middle of a political season. We just had Super Tuesday, and we had a Tuesday after a Tuesday already, and we had Louisiana the other day, a couple of days ago, and we won in a record number, the highest number ever recorded. But we're in the middle of an election right now, and we're fighting crooked Joe Biden, who's the worst president in the history of our country, by far, who's let this country go to hell. The borders, millions and millions of people coming in from prisons, from mental institutions. They're terrorists. Many people coming in from prisons and mental institutions. Think of it. And terrorists are coming into our country. And this guy's just letting them come in by the millions. I think we have 15 million people already. People don't say that. I say it. And I'll bet I'm right, too. So we're going through this weaponization of our government to try and knock out somebody's political opponent. And so far, based on the polls, it's not working at all. The people understand it. We have a man who just ruled he'd like the trial to start in 21 days or something. And I don't know how you can have a trial that's going on right in the middle of an election. Not fair. Not fair. It's not fair at all. He knows that, too. He's a Democrat judge. He wants to do that because they're all trying to damage Trump as much as possible. It's having the reverse effect, but maybe someday it won't. I don't know. but it's having the reverse effect. It's a terrible, terrible precedent, a terrible thing to do. They could have started this when I left office. You could have gone back 3 years, more than that. When I left office, all of these things could have been started so we wouldn't be quibbling over starting this week or that week or 2 days or 3 days. It wouldn't have mattered. This thing would have been over 2 years ago. They could have started. They should have never started because there's no case. If you read Andy McCarthy's piece, if you read Jonathan Turley's piece, if you read legal scholars all over the world, they say this DA case is a hoax and it's something that shouldn't have. It's not even a crime. They say there's no crime, and there is no crime. So I just say it's a sad day for this country when you have something like this. And remember the words, should have been started 3 years ago if they were going to start it at all. And then you wouldn't be quibbling over what week it's going to end, days. They're quibbling over days and hours. They wouldn't be quibbling at all. They never started it. And you know why they didn't start it? Because they didn't know I'd be running, and they didn't know how well I'd do. And if I were not running, or if I were doing poorly like everyone else has done, because they're all gone, they're all knocked out except for crooked Joe Biden. If I were doing poorly, this wouldn't be happening, and none of these trials would have been happening. If I wasn't running, they wouldn't be happening. So it's a sad day in our country in many respects, but the good day is that the appellate division was fair. It's a lot of money still, but the judge is corrupt, in my opinion. He's the most overturned judge. He's been overturned 5 times in this case alone. He ruled against me before he even knew anything about the case. He ruled against me. The whole case was all about damages, and there were no damages. And perhaps you'll get him to tell you about what took place in terms of a settlement negotiation, because those weren't the numbers he was discussing. Those weren't the numbers. It's a disgrace what's happening in our country, and we have to get our country back, and we're going to get our country back. That's what's going to happen. November 5th, I believe, will be the most important day in the history of our country. We'll get these people out of there, and we'll seal up the borders, and we'll, as I say, drill, baby, drill. We'll be drilling. We'll get energy costs down. We'll get rid of the ridiculous electric car mandate, so nobody's ever heard of anything so foolish and so stupid. And we'll bring crime back to law and order. We're going to get those words law and order back, because our cities are a disaster. Greatly respect the decision of the appellate division, and we will abide by that. We'll put up cash or bond very quickly, securities, cash or bond, whatever it is. We'll put it up very quickly, and we'll win the case. Todd, maybe I'll have Todd say a couple of words, and then I'll have any questions or anything you want to ask. Okay, Todd, wherever you may be, please.
Thank you, President Trump. So, as we said in court today...
All right, there you have it, live sound from Donald Trump at the courthouse in New York after we learned that the hush money case, the Alvin Bragg case against Donald Trump, will begin on April 15th, despite the Trump legal team's efforts to secure a longer delay. That came forth following a dump of evidence, a number of documents, thousands, in fact, a couple of weeks ago. This was supposed to be the day that the trial began. It turned into a hearing that established a new date. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, alongside Kaylee Lines here on Balance of Power. Kaylee, a lot was just said, beginning with election interference, referring to Joe Biden and his thugs, the weaponization of the DOJ, which we have tended to hear at moments like these when he's in a court.
Yeah, making similar arguments that this is election interference. And you make the point about Biden and his thugs. He says every single one of them is being run by the president and his thugs. Of course, Joe, that is factually incorrect. The Department of Justice has been operating in an independent way, at least in the federal brought cases against the former president. This, of course, is a state case brought by the Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg. That is really the case that is in question today, that will be going to trial on April 15th. But he wasn't even just talking about his legal issues here and talking about what he called corruption within them. He also raised some things pertaining to his presidency versus President Biden's. The idea that October 7th wouldn't have happened, Russia wouldn't have invaded Ukraine if he were president. And he again repeated that there was no inflation when he was president. Of course, the inflation was lower than it has been during the Biden administration, but still there was inflation. It was right around 2% consistently throughout the years of his administration.
Yeah, he went on to invoke the border, referring to migrants from prisons and mental institutions, which we obviously cannot corroborate here, and I'm not sure that Border Patrol can, saying that Joe Biden is allowing them to come in. Interesting as well, after saying that hundreds of millions of people have crossed the border, Kaylee, he said, no one else will tell you that, but I bet I'm right, making it clear to everyone in the room that he wasn't sure about those numbers.
Yeah, he said he was right about 15 million coming in, I believe. Of course, when you look at the latest figures we've gotten from the end of 2023 from actual Border Patrol here in the U.S., the monthly figures were somewhere in the ballpark of about 250,000. Yeah. So again, very hard to know those figures in real time, but betting you're right and being right, as we know, are not quite the same thing, Joe.
The former president speaking without a script and continuing. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube, you can see that. If he does make news, we'll keep you posted on this. And it again follows news, Kaylee, on the trial in New York that will now begin April 15th, but it precedes news today on whether he's going to be able to make bond in this other trial, having seen it lower today by 68%. That was another element here, a development today that Donald Trump, I suspect, couldn't have anticipated.
Yeah, this was a serious reduction from $454 million, or a bond of 120% of that amount being due today, to now 10 days to pay $175 million. He did reference that in the remarks he just made, saying he will very quickly put up cash or bond. And he was actually asked earlier when he was leaving the courthouse what he would put up as collateral, and he had said cash at that time, remembering last week, Joe, that the former president said he has close to $500 million in cash, but he argues he wants to be able to put some of that to pay toward his campaign.
Should we get back to Jim Zirin?
Indeed.
He was interrupted. We were interrupted in our conversation when Donald Trump started speaking, something we wanted to make sure you heard. Former Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, and he's the host of Conversations with Jim Zirin on PBS. It's good to have you back here, Jim. After what you just heard, I think we can bank on a trial beginning on April 15th. Did you learn anything else?
Well, it was hard to learn anything because there was lie after lie after lie, misstatement after misstatement after misstatement. What he said was classic Roy Cohn, going after the prosecutors, going after the judges, going after the justice system. And there's absolutely nothing he said which could be said in court at the time of the trial. He did move to dismiss the case on grounds of prosecutorial misconduct. By the case, I mean the case in New York. And the judge dismissed it out of hand. He did move to delay the case, although he's complaining now about the delay. He's constantly moved to delay the case, and that was denied out of hand. His dates are absolutely cockeyed. Alvin Bragg did not take office until January 1, 2022. Pomerantz was in the Bragg office only a short period of time. He was in the Vance office before that. And this is a case that was brought in the normal course. They had to be investigated by the grand jury. The witnesses had to be interviewed and had to testify before the grand jury. And there is no basis whatsoever to his statements. As you pointed out, so much of what he says is speculative. He said October 7th wouldn't have happened if he'd been president. What's the basis for that? He said that Ukraine wouldn't have happened had he been president. What's the basis for that? Because his pal Putin wouldn't have done it as a favor to him? It's ridiculous. There was inflation when he was the president.
And he went on as well, Jim, to talk about how his house was raided at Mar-a-Lago. In fact, there was a search warrant when the FBI conducted that search. And he used, though, as evidence, even though raided perhaps is not the proper way to characterize it, it was a warranted search. He said that was evidence of weaponization by the DOJ and FBI. Just to remind us here, if you will, of what the actual relationship is between the Department of Justice as it pertains to these cases with the former president, and what role, if any, President Biden has in any of this.
Well, first place, President Biden has had no role. In our federal system, the president appoints the attorney general, and here the attorney general appointed Jack Smith as special counsel. You're absolutely right about the Fourth Amendment. This was not a warrantless search. It was a search with a warrant that issued out of the district court on the showing of probable cause. and he calls it a raid. The courts have said it was not a raid, and he can't characterize it as a raid. This is all meat for his base, but he persists in telling these lies on the premise that if he tells them over and over again, someone may believe it. Now, it's Trump who who says he's going to weaponize the justice system. He wants to execute the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley. He wants to be a dictator for a day, and don't believe it's only going to be for one day. And his rhetoric and his lies are the classic rhetoric of a dictator, because dictators, Hitler, Perón, others, first talk about the decline in the country. It's called declinism. People have written about it. And you say the country is going to the dogs, and then you have to blame someone. So whom is he blaming? He's blaming the immigrants, and he's blaming the justice system. And it's classic Roy Cohn for him to blame individuals in the justice system and to personalize the justice system, which is completely contrary to and undermines our rule of law.
Well, Jim, I appreciate how closely you were listening to Donald Trump and helping us clear up some of this stuff in real time here. If Donald Trump cannot post bond in the civil case today, do you believe Letitia James will begin seizing properties, or is that a threat?
Oh, no, she certainly will begin seizing properties, but I believe that based on every indication that he has the wherewithal to post a cash bond or to post a bond for the $175 million, which he'll post within the 10-day period. The real question is what's going to happen to the appeal on the merits. And this is just a little bit of gamesmanship. But it's very well settled in the law that you don't get a stay of a judgment because you appeal. You get a stay of the judgment only if you post a bond. Lawyers call it a supersedious bond because it supersedes the judgment. And here, Donald Trump had to post a bond, and he said that he didn't have the money to post the bond for $500,000, and he said that in court, and then he publicly and said he had the money and that there would be no hardship. So he's all over the lot.
Well, and Jim, of course, in the civil case, it is a civil case. This was a ruling by a judge, both that the fraud had been committed and then what he needed to pay in damages as a result. In the criminal case, though, this will be a trial by jury. It will be a jury of his peers. This is how the system works here in the United States. And just keeping in mind here that this is historic and that we are talking about a former president, someone the American people probably know best out of any public figure out there. How hard will it be come April 15th when they begin jury selection to actually find a jury that can be unbiased against Trump?
Well, Trump is, of course, a national figure. It'll be very difficult to find jurors who have not heard of him and have not formed some opinion about him. But through examination of the jurors, the court can probe whether there is any bias against him that would prevent the juror from deciding the issue based on the evidence presented to them in court. Now, in the E. Jean Carroll case, which Trump lost, the jurors were asked questions like, have you ever attended a Trump rally? Do you believe that Biden won the last presidential election? And answers to questions like that would disclose bias. There might be other questions that might disclose bias, but the real question is, you'd say to the juror, can you serve as a fair and impartial juror and decide the question in accordance with the evidence presented to you at the trial? Most of these arguments that Trump has made, if not all, would never be admissible in a court of law. The case is going to be decided. The evidence which involves the payments to the porn star and Stormy Daniels and his and and the judge will give instructions to the jury as to whether that involves a violation of New York law. It's called falsification of business records, with the underlying crimes being election fraud and tax fraud. And that's what's in the indictment.
All right, Jim Zirin, thank you so much for reacting in real time, not just to the ruling from the judge about when this trial will begin today, but of course, the remarks we got from the former president as we heard them. Jim Zirin, former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York. We appreciate your time. Now, it's worth pointing out that Donald Trump has been taking questions. He has actually just wrapped up his news conference, but he was asked whether he plans to testify. In his answer, he said, "I don't know that you're going to have the trial." Of course, there does remain the question of the appeal, which he said he will pursue, Joe, but he did say, "I will have no problem testifying. I didn't do anything wrong."
Sure. We'll see if that opportunity emerges and whether he actually means that. We heard a lot from the former president today, Kaylee. It took us 20 minutes to unpack everything we heard in about a 5-minute speech there that we brought you live here on Bloomberg. Would love to know what our panel thinks of all of this.
Indeed. Let's bring them in now. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors, are both with us. So I'm sure, Rick and Jeannie, that you heard the former president speaking just as we did. Once again, an opportunity to, I guess, address a legal issue he is facing, but really use it as a campaign speech to talk about Russia, the border. EVs worked their way in there, a few other policy areas as well. I guess, Rick, at what point does it have to stop being campaign speeches when he's fighting these legal battles, or is this going to keep working for him?
No, I have no doubt that in Donald Trump's mind, maybe different than his campaign managers, he sees this as part of the campaign, that it's a forum that he otherwise wouldn't get. If he had held an event somewhere today, we would not be broadcasting live his comments. And so I think in his mind, this is a higher, better use of his time is sitting in a courtroom. In most cases, he has not been required to be there. He's elected to do it because he sees the value in getting this kind of attention. And arguably, it's not been a problem for him. You look at the survey data, there's never been an instance that I recall where the numbers dipped because of an appearance he had at one of these trials. And the fact that he says that he's willing to testify probably strikes fear in the hearts of the campaign and the lawyers that represent him. But he sees it as an unbelievable opportunity. It's like a debate without the opposition, or the opposition who you can pummel all day long. And so the reality is he's going to do what he thinks is in his self-interest. Right now, using the legal system to run for president is what he's doing. There's really very little about the case he talked about today. It was really all about running for president. And so if he can make these things, these cases about him, Biden trying to deny him the presidency, then voters will believe these are a campaign stop. And then that's when he gets his victory that he's looking for.
That's a pretty remarkable world to be in here. Jeannie, Joe Biden takes a lot of flack for when he's having a bad day. Maybe he's a little difficult to understand. Maybe he just downright looks tired. People say he looks old, can't always understand what you're saying depending on the day. I don't know, again, who the audience was for that address, but it strikes me that these stem winders that are just going with no direction, he's not reading a speech, he's just kind of following this stream of thought, naming names. It'd be very confusing for voters. Does this change anyone's mind? Does this convince an independent, undecided voter that the government is targeting Donald Trump?
Joe, are you saying that Mark Pomerantz is not on the lead mind of all voters across the country? I mean, there was so much of this that was just, non sequiturs, winding around. And you guys covered so beautifully so many of the falsehoods, from the idea that there is collusion with the Justice Department at the federal level and the state, to the idea that there was no inflation under Trump and the Ukraine withdrawal and all the rest. But, while I was listening to it, I was just thinking, a few hours earlier, we had Senator Marco Rubio on ABC, the Sunday morning show. And what was he talking about? And I think this gives us a sense as to how much what Trump is saying resonates with people, including mainstreamers, theoretically, like Marco Rubio. He was talking about how he would be honored to be considered a vice presidential nominee for Donald Trump. He was talking about the fact that the world was safer under Donald Trump, that there were, challenges in the 2020 election. I mean, the list goes on, and that is a sitting senator from the state of Florida. So I think if as much of these falsehoods as Donald Trump lays out in these speeches, there is a big chunk of not only his voters, but the Republican Party and independents across the country who believe what he says. And that does bring us to the fence sitters and the independents and the moderates. But the reality is there is an audience for what he is saying. And my question to this judge is, are we going to have to hear this every day? Or is there going to be some kind of gag order when this trial goes into effect on April 15th to shut some of this down?
Well, Jeannie brings up a really good point, Rick, that there is obviously a sizable chunk of the electorate that is voting for Trump in the Republican primaries, that has made him at this point the presumptive Republican nominee, that does believe a lot of what he says to be true. This idea that the Department of Justice, the FBI, the judicial system overall is being weaponized against him. And at a certain point, when you look at the facts and look at perhaps the fiction, isn't perception reality? And how do you deal with that if you're an opposing campaign?
Yeah, no, look, this is the challenge for even news organizations to cover him.
Yeah.
Not just the opposing campaign, is that he does throw out all these statistics. He talked about 15 million illegal immigrants. There's no data to support that when you ask his campaign. We'd like you to tell us where you got that number. They give you links that actually have nothing to do with that. So yeah, I mean, do you let him say these things unchallenged like we did today? Do you stop in the middle of broadcast and say this is actually incorrect? We've seen a lot of news organizations struggle with that. I think it's easier actually for the campaign, because the Biden campaign can just put commercial after commercial saying, Donald Trump lied about this, Donald Trump lied about that. And they can use their money and advertising strength and the bully pulpit of the presidency to push back on that. And frankly, part of the complaint that a lot of Democrats have had about this campaign is they haven't been doing that. They kind of let Trump be Trump all during the early primary stages. Maybe they were optimistic that some Republican would emerge and give them a hard time. That didn't happen. And only now have they become sort of more aggressive in pushing back on some of these things. But some of that damage is done. I mean, you've seen how he's consolidated his strength around the party to the point where senators like Marco Rubio have completely changed their tune about some of his policies and are now willing to participate in his administration. Do not underestimate, as our previous guest said, the power of the Roy Cohen, attack, right? And just so attack your opponent, attack the judges, attack anybody who disagrees with me. What I say is right, and that's all that matters. And that's the campaign for Donald Trump. And so, the question that the Biden campaign has to do is what's the most effective way of tamping that down so that it is not something that voters start to agree with only because Donald Trump says so.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, our signature panel with us today in the heat of the moment. And we have had some breaking news today. Thanks to both of you, Bloomberg Politics contributors, for the insights on what we heard from Donald Trump. The court date we've got now, April 15, the start of the trial. Kaylee will find out if he can pay this bond before the day is out. That deadline is looming.
Yeah, well, he now has 10 days because of this appeals court ruling to pay that $175 million. Of course, the deadline was today, and the $454 million bond, or I guess payment he would have to make, the bond was significantly more than that. So deadlines are moving around, but the point being, Joe, that this calendar is getting complicated and difficult for Donald Trump and his legal team, especially when you consider he has to find a way to finance not only that civil case, and of course there's the question of the E. Jean Carroll civil case as well, in which he owed more than $80 million, but also maintain a campaign and then continue to pay your lawyers for all these criminal trials in cases you are dealing with, a trial that will begin on April 15th, as we learned today.
Yeah, there's a lot flying around here today. Presumably, the former president back on his way to Florida. From here, we'll find out. Is he going to Jersey after
Maybe
this? Do we know? Is that
Bedminster.
the case? But he's done. He was at the courthouse. He was at 40 Wall Street. The action is done now. We're just going to wait to hear, I guess, at some point in the coming days, what they do with this payment, which has now been reduced to $175 million. A far cry from where it was.
Yeah, and I guess the question now is, are any of the companies that the former president went to initially in the case when the bond was larger, who refused to accept his buildings as collateral, who wanted him to have something like $1 billion in cash, he argued, in order to secure that bond, is this more favorable to them? Will he have as much difficulty paying this reduced amount?
One thing I do know, Kaylee, is we haven't mentioned the name Joe Biden very often this hour, and he's actually on the campaign trail this week. Israel, of course, is following him. We're going to talk more about that coming up next on the fastest show in politics. This is Bloomberg.
And I'm John Tucker, he in the Bloomberg newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. Well, stocks started this Monday slightly lower. This follows the best week for stocks so far this year. 8 of the 11 major index groups in the S&P 500, they are on lower right now. You have communication services among the worst performing groups. And that's where you're going to find Meta Platforms, Google parent Alphabet, and Apple. They're all lower. The European Union opened an investigation into the firm's compliance with strict new laws reining in the power of big tech. You also have shares of Intel down about 1.5%. There's a report that China is going to limit the use of U.S. chips. Right now, the S&P 500 is 8 points lower. That's down about 0.1%, 52.26 on the index. Dow Jones Industrial Average, 141 points lower. That's down about 0.4%. And the Nasdaq Composite Index, 4 points lower right now, 16,424 on the index. And we check the markets all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. Balance of Power continues now with Joe and Kaylee making sense of it all for you. We would hope.
Thank you. That's a great compliment. We just reported. Making sense of it is a whole other matter. That's what the panel's for, right,
That's
Kaylee?
right.
Thanks for being with us on the fastest show in politics, and it has been moving today with breaking news from Washington and New York, where Donald Trump now has a court date, April 15th. And it's interesting, Kaylee, when you consider that's the Bragg trial, that would allow room with a 6-week trial, as the judge has planned, for Jack Smith to have plenty of time to get a trial done here in Washington. Of course, the election subversion trial, but he's waiting, of course, to hear from the Supreme Court. And that's where we start our conversation with Greg Stohr, of course, Bloomberg Supreme Court reporter. A couple of things, Greg, that we wanted to ask you about. Thank you for stopping by. We're expected to hear arguments on that immunity question that may or may not unlock a trial for Jack Smith on April 25th. When might the court rule?
Well, that's really one of the big questions. It's both will Donald Trump win and how quickly will, if he loses, how quickly will that happen? The court has expedited arguments in the case somewhat, but there's no assurance they'll rule before the end of their term at the end of June. And if they wait until the end of June, then the timeline starts to get really tight, and it's not clear whether a trial can go forward before the election.
Well, and it's worth pointing out that the arguments are on April 25th, and if this timetable stands that we learned about today, we'll be 10 days into the criminal trial in New York by the time the Supreme Court is hearing arguments in the immunity question. Does that have any bearing on the way the justices are likely to think about this case?
Well, it shouldn't, but, they're human beings. They see the news. They know the atmospherics. And, interestingly, one of the issues here is that Jack Smith at the Supreme Court hasn't said a word about the upcoming election. He's not urging the Supreme Court, rule quickly because I need to get this trial before the election happens. Donald Trump is talking about it, but in terms of whether the Supreme Court will feel any urgency to get this ruling resolved so the trial can go forward, it's basically, it would be doing that sort of on its own rather than because of anything that Jack Smith says.
Important arguments that we'll be following tomorrow at the Supreme Court. I know you will be, Greg, on a case that involves reducing access to mifepristone, the abortion pill. What are you going to be listening for?
Yeah, so this will be the first abortion argument since 2 years ago when the court overturned the constitutional right to abortion in the Dobbs case. Yeah. This involves the pill that is used in more than half of U.S. abortions now. A lower court restricted access, and the most important aspect of that from a practical standpoint is it made it so that the pill could not be used, could not be obtained by mail if that ruling goes into effect. So huge practical consequences for American women depending on how the case comes out. And of course, huge potential political consequences given that we've seen how important abortion is at the polls.
All right, Greg Stohr, who covers the Supreme Court for us, going to have a busy day with those arguments tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, Joe, as we consider the issue of abortion, perhaps that is one of the issues working more in the favor of President Biden and Democrats down the ticket, something they will campaign on. But there are a number of forces that are working against the incumbent president, not just including the economy, but increasingly the conflict we are seeing between Israel and Hamas and the resulting toll that has been taken on Palestinian life in Gaza. It's worth pointing out that while Trump has been dominating much of the news cycle today, we did have a UN Security Council vote earlier today, a resolution approved demanding an immediate ceasefire in Gaza during Ramadan. The U.S., though, Joe, did abstain from that vote. Doesn't seem that abstention was enough to satisfy Netanyahu, though.
No, apparently this delegation has been canceled that was coming here. And abstaining was not as good as voting no, apparently, Kaylee, and that's what this came down to today.
It seems so, and we want to get an expert's opinion on this now. Joining us, I'm pleased to say, is Jonathan Panikoff, Atlantic Council Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative Director. Jonathan, great to have you back here on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I would just love to get your reaction to the consequence of this Security Council resolution. What real impact it will have on the behavior of Israel, considering it did draw an immediate reaction from the Israeli government in terms of canceling this delegation's visit?
Well, great to be back with you. Thanks for having me. Look, I don't think there's actually going to be much change one way or the other. At the end of the day, what's going to change Israeli behavior, even in the short term, is whether or not there's a hostage negotiation deal that comes about. And that's a negotiation happening with Egypt, with Qatar, and with the U.S. that was recognized in the UN Security Council resolution. I don't think this resolution, though, is actually going to make a huge difference, at least in the immediate term.
So Israel wanted a veto. They did not get it. What does that mean now for the chances of a ceasefire, or is it on to Rafah?
Yeah, I don't think it really changes the chance of a ceasefire. Blinken's been in the region. They've been meeting quite a bit. The Israelis sent a delegation. There was a report this morning that they actually have closer numbers, about 700 Palestinian prisoners, including 100 serving life sentences in exchange for about 40 Israeli hostages. So I think they're making progress, slow progress. I think this really is more about the politics. Netanyahu's really upset because what Netanyahu wanted was a direct link between the hostages and a ceasefire. No ceasefire without the hostages, which the U.S. tried to do in the resolution last Friday, vetoed by Russia and China. This says a ceasefire and release of the hostages. The U.S. is saying it's still connected. Israel is saying it's insufficient. The Arab world thinks that they're happy that something has just passed finally.
Well, Jonathan, it seems that increasingly there is somewhat of a disconnect between what the U.S. is saying and what Israel is saying, be it in regard to a potential ceasefire deal or the attempts to reach one, or just what will happen in Rafah. We heard from Vice President Kamala Harris speaking over the weekend, saying that she was ruling out nothing in terms of consequences if Israel were to pursue a military assault into Rafah. What realistically, though, could those consequences look like, and how likely is it in your mind that the U.S. would actually move to enforce any?
I think it really depends on what an operation in Rafah looks like. And that's, frankly, what Ron Dermer and Hanegbi's visit to the U.S. was supposed to discuss. If the U.S. has said now clearly that there are going to be consequences, I think there will be, but that's only if Israel goes into Rafah with multiple brigades and really storms through it in the same way it worked through Khan Yunis and Gaza City. If what Israel really does is say, okay, we recognize there's a challenge, we really do need to move as many of these people out of Rafah as possible. At the same time, we'll make this operation less of a full-scale operation and much more counterterrorism, which is what the U.S. is pushing. Then I think the U.S. actually would probably accept that. And my guess is, especially if there is a hostage deal, that's going to be much easier to complete, because any hostage deal is going to have within it a temporary pause in fighting, and Israeli operations can't just resume as they were. You've already moved the brigades out. They'll have to come back in. So I think that there is still some opportunity to work together between the U.S. and Israel, but clearly tensions are rising.
I thought you might point to conditions as part of your answer on that, Jonathan, and I wonder what your thought is, having heard outrage over the weekend from some progressive Democrats, 22 of which in the House voted against the government funding bill because it included almost $4 billion for Israel. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on Sunday morning, talking on television and on the House floor on Friday, she referred to this as an unfolding genocide on the floor of the House and called on the administration to stop sending weapons to Israel. Will conditions, or at least additional conditions, have to be attached to any further aid?
I don't know that they'll have to be attached. I mean, there was already, an executive order issued by the Biden administration making clear the humanitarian conditions related to all countries, including Israel, for U.S. weapons. I think the question is going to really be one of whether you have a temporary ceasefire and how Israel approaches this. Look, if they have a full-scale operation, then yes, I would expect many Democrats, and that includes folks like Chris Murphy and Senator Van Hollen, who have been pretty aggressive in this in the Senate, pushing back and saying, look, we have to condition aid. But if it's a smaller operation, if it's more